You're listening to I Can't Have Children, Now What? From Tutum Global, hosted by Jobi Tyson. If you're seeking answers about infertility and childlessness, this is the podcast for you, using research and lived experiences to solve history's infertility medical mysteries, while courageously taking you behind closed doors to face the question mark for 1 in 5 women sharing the same dilemma. I can't have children. Now what?
From Tutum Global in Atlanta, this is I Can't Have Children, Now What? I'm your host, Jobi Tyson. Thank you so much for listening to episode 4. Before we get started, all of you out there listening, make sure you're downloading and subscribing to us on all podcast platforms: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Spreaker. And don't forget to leave a review, rating, and share with friends to help spread the word. Okay, so in today's episode called Trigger Warning, we're going to discuss how to deal with emotional triggers. A trigger is an event or thing that causes an emotional disturbance within you. Fear, envy, scarcity, anger, frustration, self-doubt, self-pity. So we're going to talk about identifying your triggers up front and steps to have a plan or an approach in place so that you can choose to respond rather than react. The goal in dealing with triggers is to manage them and ultimately overcome them. So stay tuned. We're all extremely aware of trigger words, phrases, conversations, or experiences. So I've researched ways to release the anxiety and negative thoughts that comes with them. Whether you're childless without choice or childless by circumstance, emotional triggers are everywhere. Pregnancy announcements on social media, a TV commercial of a mom baking with her daughters, an inappropriate comment, or the dreaded baby shower invitation. Isn't it crazy how one trigger can have your stomach in knots for hours or ruin your whole day? But the most vital part is, and this is important to remember, is that the person that asked the question, offered the advice, shared a story, or their pregnancy announcement is usually completely unaware that something they said or did could have such a debilitating effect on you. Then what happens? You spend the next few days being unable to shake this off. I've even gone through periods of seclusion in the past. For childless women, sometimes it feels like the world is one giant trigger. And while many triggers can't be anticipated, there are ways you can get to know your individual triggers and find ways to try to preemptively protect yourself. First things first, you must learn your personal triggers. This may seem obvious, but everyone has different triggers and sensitivities. Not only that, they're always changing, and what can upset you one day might totally be fine the next day. Sometimes the triggers are obvious, like sonogram photos, a random woman walking in the store with a baby bump, or a trigger-filled plotline in a TV show or movie. But understanding your triggers can help remove some of the power almost immediately. Secondly, once you know and understand your triggers, then you can start building a safer space around you. Of course, there's no way to foresee every trigger out there, because there will always be a pregnant coworker or family member asking intrusive questions. But there are some concrete tactics you can use for certain triggers to manage them and ultimately overcome them. Like what you hear so far? Can you relate to emotional triggers? I know I do. Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now we're going to move on and talk about some things that really hit home that I have found helpful in dealing with triggers. Now I'm going to touch on dealing with and how to handle unavoidable triggers. But first, let me share with you the last unexpected trigger I actually experienced. Okay, so I've never been triggered on Mother's Day, probably because I distracted myself in celebrating my mother and sisters and the other women in my family. But this past Mother's Day, I was home alone. And as a leader in the childless space, for weeks prior to Mother's Day, I was overprotective of our community of childless women, ensuring that they were emotionally prepared for the day. So I poured my all into them leading up to Mother's Day. But when the day came, I was on empty. For one of my sisters, it's a tradition that she always says Happy Mother's Sister's Day to me. I always anticipate her validation and expect her appreciative message. But what caught me off guard was my younger sister's Mother's Day text, who never said Happy Mother's Day to me. Her first message from my nephew read, "My aunt has ears that really listen, arms that hug and hold, a love that's never ending, and a heart that's made of gold." Her second message read, "Happy Mother's Day. We love you and appreciate you so much." Oh my goodness. It took me hours to respond, since I was buried under the sheets struggling to contain my tears. This is what I meant when I said triggers are always changing. So that day, I found myself really struggling. Then I allowed myself to feel the feeling and understood that I was overwhelmed, number one, by the messages from the hundreds of women that I helped, followed by an unexpected message from my youngest sister. So I got up and went on with the rest of my day. So it's imperative to learn how to stop that roller coaster of emotions and allow yourself to feel the feeling. So what I've learned is, first, be mindful of your triggers. Ask yourself, what am I making this trigger mean? Whether it's an insensitive comment or something you saw or overheard, we can often make it worse, either because of envy, anger, frustration, self-doubt, or self-pity. In all reality, the trigger is bringing out our own grief and fears about your childless state. As I've mentioned, most people don't realize what they're saying has the potential to hurt you. And obviously, a passerby doesn't have a clue that their presence has triggered you. But if you're mindful, you can get to a place to manage it. So when you do feel the emotional trigger, allow yourself to feel the feelings. Let yourself feel sad. When you start peeling the layers, it's almost always sadness under the frustration, because it's easier to be angry than to feel sad. But breathe into the emotions and let yourself feel that way. Don't tell yourself you're a horrible person for feeling that way or you shouldn't be feeling it. This shit hurts. This type of insecurity is painful. Stop trying to cover it up with anger. Next, start developing different ways you can handle a trigger. Determine your desired outcomes from your triggers and what you'll need to do to accomplish them. Then pause to label your emotions. When you find yourself experiencing strong emotion, stop and ask yourself, what am I feeling? Finding a name for your feeling can help you manage it more easily. Then practice opposite actions for negative emotions. When we experience negative emotions, we can have the tendency to enforce it with negative responses. If you isolate yourself and you feel sad and lonely, you'll create more sadness and loneliness. To change the sad and lonely feelings, approach safe social situations and try to engage in activities that invoke opposite feelings. Next, reacting is allowing the emotion to guide you. You might yell or even shut down. Responding, on the other hand, is waiting until you have assessed the situation and calmed down before you take any action. What's happening is we start to draw the link between our present day's emotional triggers and painful past experiences, which makes us feel vulnerable. Even in our head, we know what's going on. We are triggered by the same people, circumstances, and events. Rather than fighting and getting increasingly frustrated, try thinking of your wounds, your emotional triggers, and your reactions all as a muddy swamp. Like in quicksand, the more we try to escape it, the more stuck we get. Reactive and frantic movements would not only get us sucked in deeper, but our movement would also even expand the size of the swamp, making it even harder to reach the solid ground around it.
And now a quick break to hear from one of our sponsored affiliates, Booking.com, where our listeners can escape the city and spend your vacation or staycation at adults-only hotels and destinations. Along with Booking.com, we've curated adult-only outings just for you. If you're interested in booking an adults-only trip, whether afar or local, visit www.tutumglobal.com/travel for great deals right now.
We're going to move on and talk about how to recover from trigger exposure, answer a listener's question, and offer ways to improve the moment. As I stated earlier, a lot of triggers are simply unavoidable. Your friend complains to you that she's pregnant for the 4th time. You see a celebrity previously struggling with infertility posting a pregnancy announcement on Instagram. This is just the price we all pay for living in the mother-centric world. But recently I received a letter from one of our listeners asking how to manage and recover from trigger exposure. Our letter is from New Zealand. The question is, "Hi Jobi, I have a question for a Q&A consideration, and thanks for accepting me into the Tutum sisterhood. The next step on my grief journey has taken a while. Recently, the loneliness of not being a mom really hit home. First, there was the mistake of trying to support my niece. I wanted to be able to be part of her baby shower, but I left just feeling devastated at what I could not do for myself. This really triggered me, and it was like hell. Then the next day, I was walking in the grocery store, and it seemed like mothers were all over the place with their children, which really hurt me as something that I had envisioned doing. So I want to learn how to actively heal myself. How can I heal from these triggers?" Okay, before I give my answer, I just think it's amazing how this podcast is spreading, and I get to receive so many messages from around the world. Thank you so much again. Okay, so back to New Zealand. In order to heal from these triggers, first you need to turn the thought around. Deep down, we really don't like ourselves when we think such bitter and envious thoughts. Instead of thinking critically about your family member or a random stranger, try to feel compassion for them. I'm pretty sure you would never wish this pain on anyone you are close to. So instead of fuming, try and be grateful that your sweet niece has no clue what this journey is like. But on the other hand, definitely protect your peace. And if this is too much for you, be open and honest. Also, make sure you have a full team of support set up around you to help you find your emotional footing. Those who can support you on your journey can include your partner. If you have an empathetic partner on this journey, trust them with your feelings of heartbreak. It's good for them to see and understand your pain, even if they can't fix it. Just remember that you don't need to put everything on them. So also talk to your family and friends about your triggering situation and your feelings. Sometimes talking can really help reduce emotional triggers and promote understanding. Your family members and friends know you better than anyone. They know when to anticipate your triggers, so they can help encourage you during those times. And use emotional control skills to tolerate unpleasant feelings. You can then act out those unpleasant feelings in a way that doesn't make things worse. In fact, it can be healthy for you. Some ways to do this is distracting yourself to help tolerate difficult feelings and create opposite emotions. Do something that creates emotions other than the one you're experiencing, like watching a comedy, for example. And find support groups, Childless blogs, Facebook groups like Tutum Sisterhood. This is your tribe who know firsthand what everything feels like. Trust them, lean on them, open up to them. Also, professional therapy can truly be an invaluable resource in dealing with triggers and childlessness. Therapists are trained to help you process the complex emotions that surround grief, fear, anxiety, and social pressure. If possible, try to find a therapist who specializes in infertility or grief. Lastly, Learn how to improve the moment by finding other ways to make your present distress bearable. Start finding meaning, relaxation, and focusing entirely on one thing in the moment. Give yourself encouragement. You're stronger than you realize. After all, you're taking steps to change. Everyone's journey is different and will have different triggers that are personal to us. The point is to stop beating up on yourself. Let go of the frustration and release the resentment towards yourself and others in this uncharted process we find ourselves in. With practice, the reaction to your emotional triggers can subside, although they may never go away. You can practice this step at any time to actively shift your emotional state. So instead of trying to suppress your emotions, choose to feel something different when the trigger arises. This is how you gain emotional freedom. Expand your window of tolerance gradually. Staying away from things that trigger you works in the short run, but it might not work in the long run. Avoiding triggers all the time can be stressful and unrealistic. Start small and work your way up. Continue until you have successfully managed your emotions to the point that the experience is no longer a trigger. Well, I hope this episode was valuable for your growth. Be good to yourself, and thank you for listening to I Can't Have Children, Now What? This podcast series is about journeys resulting in childlessness. It's about thinking for yourself, but also thinking as a community, gathering knowledge from personal experiences, investigating infertility's medical mysteries from a woman's perspective, and the healing of women who are childless not by choice or by circumstance. Make sure to visit our website, ican'thavechildren.com, where you can subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform, so you'll never miss a show. If you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating and review on Apple Podcast. And please follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Childless Women. If you have requested topics and questions, visit ican'thavechildren.com. From Tutum Global, I'm your host, Jobi Tyson.
You've just listened to the I Can't Have Children, Now What? Podcast with your host, Jobi Tyson. If you're enjoying our podcast, tell a friend, family member, or coworker about it. You can support this podcast and get exclusive bonus content, episode transcripts, polls, and more by becoming a monthly patron at ican'thavechildren.com. Thanks for listening.